Well, thanks for coming to another Sunday class here from Provo, Utah, from the Brigham Young University or BYU Library Family History Center. Today we're going to talk about unlocking the genealogical treasure of the Library of Congress. And this is an old picture, but the building hasn't been changed hardly at all up to the present. The reason why this is a pertinent topic is because, in a sense, you get a feeling from a lot of people, I do, that they would just be, it would be wonderful to be able to go to the Library of Congress and do research. And so we're going to kind of talk about what that would entail and what you need to know and what you need to be able to do in order to even make anything other than a nice visit to a beautiful place to visit with a lot of interesting exhibits. So we'll get right into it here. So the Library of Congress was founded in 1800, and that's a long time ago, to serve the needs of Congress. Now you've got to remember that this is the Library of Congress. So the vast amount of information that's in here is here because of its supporting role to the Congress of the United States and the records from the Congress of the United States. So I'll talk about a little bit later of the separation between the Library of Congress and the National Archives. But it's evolved into the largest. I'm giving a qualification here, and that is physical library, because it's a vast repository of information that encompasses centuries of human history and achievement. Okay, that's kind of the promotional kind of end of what's there. And it has approximately 173 million items. Now, those include texts and books and other items. But might want to just know that the Internet Archive, which is archive.org, has billions of items. And they're all accessible and they're all searchable. And all of the texts, which number right now 143 million plus, are completely searchable, word for word, all of them. And so it's an interesting contrast between the Library of Congress with its procedures for getting into the information. And that's what we'll talk about today. I'm not going to go through these in individual kinds of ways, but I wanted to list them here. Normally, they would appear as bullet points, but I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to put all these up at the same time. So there are three main buildings, but the ones that we usually think of is the Thomas Jefferson Building, and it opened in 1897. And then there's another James Madison Memorial Building and the John Adamson Building. Beyond that, there's high density storage facility in Fort Meade and the Packard campus for audiovisual conservation in Culpeper in Virginia, and the Annex Building, house of the National Library Service for the Blind and Print Disabled. Okay, those are all parts of it. And what you're going to find out initially about the Library of Congress is that they have a lot of books. It's a big library. It has a lot of books. But those books, the books in that 107, or those items in that 173 million figure, are mostly stored off-site. So when you go to the library, you may be able to find some items that are immediately or not immediately, but let's say available in the sense that you can look at them, and others could take weeks to obtain. And that's just keep that in mind as we go through the process here, because I'll probably repeat that a number of times. Now you see a little circle down there. That's the entrance to the Library of Congress. As you go into the library, that's where you go in. It's got some nice big front doors that aren't used, because that door is the door where you get into and have to pass through security. This is kind of the time frame for that building. It's open Tuesday through Saturday, 10 to 5, and it has extended hours until 8 p.m. on Thursdays. Let me contrast this with the BYU library. The BYU library is the Harold B. Lee Library on campus, which is open from around 7 in the morning until midnight during normal operating hours and gets there a little bit earlier, like I don't remember if it's like 5 o'clock in the morning, and then it closes at 2:30 in the morning. So as far as access to the library is concerned, this isn't like really optimal for researchers because you just get going and then you're got to leave at 5 o'clock. So I think that it's an interesting issue, but it's one. And you'll need to reserve a free timed entry ticket online before your visit. So unless you have some kind of visit, then you'll have to get a ticket to get in. Those are all this is done online at the Library of Congress website. Now, the Library of Congress website is loc.gov, loc.gov. And people like me who have been working with the Library of Congress a greater part of their lives basically call it the LOC. And that's how we refer to the Library of Congress. Just kind of a note here about some of my background, perhaps, so you'll know if there's some reason why I should be able to talk about the Library of Congress. Okay. It's probably a good question to ask. When I was about in the fourth or fifth grade, and that would mean I was about 10 or 11 years, 8 or 9 or 10 years old, I began to ride my bike across a few blocks, not too many too far, maybe about a mile from my house to the Phoenix Public Library, which was a nice library. And I would spend the entire summers going back and forth between the library. They limited me to 7 books. And so it didn't take me more than a few days to read those. So I was back to the library to get 7 more books. And that's one of the major activities I pursued for the rest of my life as I was growing up until I was old enough to go to the University of Utah. And then I spent time again in the library because that's what I did. I mean, I just assumed that's what you did when you did any kind of learning is go to the library. And then as soon as I returned from a mission for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and got married, I got a job in the library as a bibliographer. Bibliographers verify book orders or verify books that are in the library, the holdings of the library, which that meant that I spent hours and hours and hours doing nothing more than going through the catalog, card catalog, 3x5 paper cards, and checking for the books and also going through all of the other possible sources for looking up books, the existence of a book, and to verify if a book could be ordered or if it was already in the library. So I spent years doing that. And then as soon as I graduated, went to the Army, came back, I went to law school. And even before I started law school, I got a job as a reference librarian at the ASU Law Library, where I worked until I graduated from law school. And after that, I spent a considerable amount of time because we didn't have computers back then in the dark ages. And so I had to go into libraries to get all the information. And the only thing that's changed in my life about libraries is I'm still working in a library. And I've been working in the library as a church service missionary now for 21 years. So I've spent a lot of time in libraries and I've visited the Library of Congress, and I'll talk a little bit about that and the process that we needed to know. And when you get to the Library of Congress, you're going to have to go through security screening, including metal detectors and X-ray machines. They will X-ray anything you're carrying in that you have with you. Just knowing that's interesting. So these are the things that there are. There's 38 million cataloged books and print materials. There's 70 million manuscripts, sound recordings, images, photographs. I really like the photographs, and they're on the Library of Congress has quite a large collection on their website, and I use those all the time. So they're really nice because they're usually old and in the public domain, so they can be used. They've got a lot of maps. I think maps is kind of a dead issue for libraries, if you want my opinion. Almost every square inch of the world is now on maps online. And it's only the historical maps going back that show us boundaries and all that that are still waiting to be, would or be usable. But because of the huge number of maps that are online now, historical maps, I'm not sure that there would be anything there that you couldn't find online. And the largest rare book collection in North America and a digital catalog of records. The catalog for the Library of Congress, when it was on paper, was in a book, and it was multi-volumes, about 20 volumes. The catalog was 20 big books, like an inch thick books of cataloging material. So learning about the Library of Congress catalog is not just a matter of going through what we call the Dewey Decimal System, which is not what they're using. It's the Library of Congress cataloging system. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. And they add about 12,000 items a day. Most of those come from the Congress. And they have a total of number of, anyway, there's the exact number that was as of November of 2021, which means there's probably a lot more there now. So it's across the street from the Capitol, if you want to give a location in Washington, D.C. It's within walking distance of a metro subway tunnel entrance. There's almost non-existent parking in this area. So it's a lot easier to get there if you take the train and come in to the metro. But it's an interesting place. And even if you don't ever have the aspirations of doing research, it's worth the effort to go there if along with the other things. I would put it number one or two after the United States Capitol as the places that you really need to visit if you go to Washington, D.C. It's right there. Okay, so here's the key to this. The access to the records in the Library of Congress requires online library searching skills. Why is that? Because the catalog's online. And the only way you're going to find it is to know how to use the catalog and how things happen. Now, one of the things that I learned, you're talking to somebody that spent a lot of time in libraries, and so I'm, sort of weird from that standpoint. But on the other hand, this is what I lived with. And one thing I found, it was not something very quickly found, but as a bibliographer at the University of Utah Marriott Library, I had to visit almost every single part of the library because I had to physically go look and see if there was a book on the shelf. That was one of the requirements. And then I had to track the books down if I didn't find it on the shelf. And what I found was that I found in cataloging was not an exact science, and that the same subjects, and the one I was interested in at that time and writing an article on, writing a paper on, was Cristobal Colon, or Christopher Columbus. And I found his records. I found books and materials about Christopher Columbus in at least two or three different parts of the library, completely different physically. So the catalog said this, but even if you'd gone through the catalog, you had to realize that there were records in different parts of the library for the same thing. And that's the same thing that happens with the Library of Congress and all other libraries that use any cataloging system. Cataloging systems are not all science. They're a lot of art. in it on how you use it. It's kind of, you have to have be a little bit imagining things in order to actually make things related in a way that can be found. And if you're thinking in terms of what happens if you go to a local library, like your local town library or city library, or even a big city library, you realize that you've got to expand your idea of what it means to do library research. Library research is it is a site dependent skill. In other words, I may be very good at doing research in libraries in general, but I still have to learn how to find things in each library that I go to. So if I go to my local Provo City Library, I realize pretty quick that they're using kind of a modified Dewey Decimal type system. And so I can just walk through the stacks. I can walk along the shelves and I can pretty much tell what categories of books are in what kind of an area. And if I look at the little signs they have up, then I can figure that out. And so I can begin to understand where the information might be that I would like to do. Now, my past experience was that I would go to the library frequently, pull all the books off the shelf that I was interested in, take them home, read them or look at them and decide I didn't want to read them, take the whole stack back and go through the process again and again. And so I would take, over a period of time, in any one subject, I would pull all the books off the library on that subject. Now, let's fast forward to working in another big library like the Salt Lake Family Search Library in Salt Lake City, Utah. So what do you do? What's my way I did that library for many years was I would walk into the library. I would discover the area that I was interested in, for example, Rhode Island as a state. I would find the section of books that they had cataloged as Rhode Island, and I would just start doing what I had always done, is pulling them off the shelves one by one, bringing them over to the desk, going through the books, looking for the information I was looking, putting back on the shelf where they didn't want me to shelve them again, which I could have done, but I didn't do. And then I would pull more books off. So per course of a day or two or five or six at the library, I would have gone through probably nearly all of the books for that particular subject that they had in the library. And that was the way I would get started with my research, because then I would know what I needed to know, what I didn't know, and what the books apparently had, and what the books didn't apparently have, and what I would have to do to start getting more information than I was using before. So that's kind of the way you do that. But working that same way in the Library of Congress is not possible because not all the books are on the shelves, and because of the same thing that I mentioned just a moment ago about all things being in different places. Genealogy is helpful because everything is cataloged according to location. So the location of the record at the time it was created. And so that gets it really, let's say, much easier than the average kind of research effort that you would be doing in a library, a general library that is shelving things. Now, in the Library of Congress, they're still going to use the cataloging by topic, but they also have their own topics. And this is one. And because of the nature of very large libraries and archives, the way you do research has to be adapted to each repository. That just means that when I go to a different library, I have to figure out how it's organized, what the catalog means, where the books, what's accessible, what isn't accessible. And you'll find perhaps as you keep going that if you go to a larger library, you're going to have a section in that library called special collections, and they're not going to be available at all unless you go in and register and go through a process of establishing yourself as a researcher, and then you may get access to the items that are in the closed stacks or in the special collections libraries. And it may take more than just saying I'm a researcher to get into the library. And I'll give an example of that is the Huntington Library in Los Angeles. It's actually up in close to Pasadena. But anyway, the Huntington is something where you have to pre-register and pre-qualify to get access. So there's not it's not as easy as just simply walking over. Now, here's something that's I think is very important to understand. And if you don't get anything else out of this kind of explanation here, is why do you think the Library of Congress has something you need for your research that's not available elsewhere? I would, I actually ask people this question every time I get a question about the Library of Congress. I say, what are you looking for in the Library of Congress that you think is either A, unique to the Library of Congress and that you need it and you've identified that, or isn't available anyplace else just because it's not unique. It may be just something that just didn't happen to be anyplace else. And that's a serious question, and it's really hard to answer. It is really, really hard. But before, I would pack up my car or get an airplane ticket or whatever and go to Washington, D.C. to go sit at the Library of Congress and do research. I would be very, very sure that the things that I was looking for were not available someplace else in the country, were really available at the National Archives and not at the Library of Congress, or were available only at certain other libraries across the country, repositories, special collections libraries, all sorts of things. So there's a lot of interest. Now, one thing that's the background to all this is that beginning many years ago, we started to digitize books, records, and items. And I mentioned at the beginning of this a contrast between the Internet Archive, which has billions, literally, of items, and right now 143 million texts and volumes and books completely searchable. Contrast that to the Library of Congress and the fact that very few of the books, percentage wise, have been digitized, of the records have been digitized by them directly. Doesn't mean that other copies of the items aren't available in digital format, but that most of it is just still on paper, especially the government stuff. So it's getting digitized, but the digitized rate is probably not greater than the increased rate. So how do you know what you're looking for may be in the Library of Congress? So how do we go about finding out if we want to go to the Library of Congress? And the answer is realizing that only a small part of the library is open to browsing for books, like this is, my general modus of operandi of beginning research on any subject, of going pulling every book I could find off the shelves. And they're usually kept in warehouses. And you can reserve materials in advance. Okay, so now you have to figure out what's in the library that you want to look at. And then you have to contact the library and go through all of this particular page of information here in the Library of Congress. All of these are on the loc.gov website, the Library of Congress website. All these slides are there. And so what you have there is a system of what they call reading rooms. And that's not, unique for the Library of Congress. There's other libraries and other archives, mostly archives, have reading rooms. The Special Collections Library, the Harold B. Lee Library at BYU has reading room. And that's basically their way of controlling who has access to the special collections material. And that's the way it's done. If you go to the Maryland State Archives, where we spend a year digitizing records for Family Search, you're going to find the same thing. Here's the general room, the reading room, the big room of the library of the archives, but you don't have access to even any of the books or any records from that reading room. There's nothing there that you can even look at. You just have to go to the catalog and request the items you want or work in advance. And unfortunately, like the Maryland State Archives, at the time we were there, they had yet to digitize their paper catalog. So the only way you could find out what was there was to go sit there and go through the catalog. But we have on Library of Congress, we have an online catalog. And that's kind of the key to getting into the records that are. So here's the things you need to think about before you go to the Library of Congress. And before you even think about going to the Library of Congress, you should do these things. Number one, you should have a clear and focused research objective. And in other words, you need to know what you need to know. And you need to know what kinds of records you need in order to answer that question. Okay, so let's give you an example. You need to know the history of a certain place in the United States, and you go and you look online and you find out that there's a book that was compiled for that history of that place, but that for some reason there's a limited number of copies of that book, which is not unusual. And only one library, the Library of Congress, is the only one that lists that book as available. Okay. So now you have that's your clearly focused objective. You may want to expand that like you're doing history about this area. And so you want to use the resources of the LOC to get into and research the history of this area so that you can give background and maybe find your ancestors in that particular area that you're looking for. So you may have some kind of like that, but you need to kind of pare it down and get a research objective that is realistic and is doable, and then spend your time looking at everything else that's online and more accessible and available to see if you don't already have all that information that you need someplace around. And understanding that there are hundreds of large libraries in the United States. Every university has a library, and some of them have very, very large libraries. University of Michigan, UCLA, and there's public libraries that are massive. The New York Public Library, the Boston Public Library. These are huge repositories. And one of the largest collections of genealogical information, for example, is in the New York Public Library. And so going to different libraries and their catalogs and doing this is a process of research. And you may end up, after you do this, of actually finding out that you need to go to the Library of Congress. Okay, because they have what you need. Okay, that's it. So what I've said is an exhaustive online search for pertinent online records. This is, when I say exhaustive, you really need to develop very good online research tools, even if you're thinking you're going to the Library of Congress, because you've got to have those tools to find the records in the Library of Congress. So that's kind of the way it works. So you need a determination that what you want is not in any other archive or repository. It's going to be easier, perhaps, to get into other repositories than it is to spend your time downtown DC. Okay. And familiarity with the library schedule and open hours. I went through some of them, which of course can change. And there's one thing you ought to know about Washington, D.C., and is that the place shuts down periodically because of demonstrations. So you never know if they're going to have anything open or not have anything open, and you have to work around that. And an awareness of the requirements for a reader's registration. Okay, so now you've got to go to do some training at the library to get a reader's card. which gives you the access to the library. So my wife and I both went through that process to get our reader's cards so we could actually get in and look at the stacks and see what was there and do research. And then you need the catalog. And that's the big if. If you can understand and use the catalog and you find things that you like to look at, then when you found those things, then you go out and check to see if everybody else has them, if anybody else has them. Okay. Planning to spend weeks visiting the library every single day. That happens because, as I mentioned, most of the stuff in the collection of the Library of Congress is offline, is out of that building. And you can walk in and find you have 10 things on your list, and there might be one of them that's in the actual physical Jefferson Library there, but everything else is out away, and it can take 2 to 3 days or 2 to 3 weeks to get that material. And when we went to the library, the questions we asked about the availability of certain material, they would say something like, yes, we can have that in 3 to 4 days. So you can get into the situation where you're there physically and you want something and you're ending up sitting and waiting for 3 or 4 or 5 days or a week or longer, perhaps, to get the material that you've retrieved from the outside location. When it's there, then it's there for whatever period of time they've established that they will hold that. Now, you can do some of that research and requesting online before going to the library, but then they're going to put it on a shelf for you. And then when you get to the library, you still have to go through all the procedures. Then you have that available for a period of time. Skills to physically research old documents and records. I think this is, it's just basically you're going to be starting out working with older documents and records, and it's a good idea if you know how to use those and where to do. And you'll need a computer, a smartphone, or camera with a tripod to make copies. Now, they may take, it depends on the repository. Some repositories will allow you to use a tripod. Some will not let you use a tripod. So there's a difference, where you do. And first of all, when you go to a library like this, if you go to the Salt Lake Library or you go to BYU Library or you're going to travel and go to the library, when you find your material, you don't do all your research there in the library. You just copy as much of it as you can possibly copy so that you can do your actual research with the materials that you've gathered. So when you're going to the library, unless you're going to spend like the whole summer into the fall or a year at the library, you're going to be wanting to focus on getting the information into your possession through making copies. Now, in the old days, you had to use a pen and pencil, or pencil on, not pens, no pens, pencil on a piece of paper. Now, most of them have allowed some and limited amount. So you need to check what the current requirements are for using a camera in the library to take pictures of books and records. And of course, if they're talking about copyright, then you're having kind of a different issue altogether. Plan to spend your time researching, not writing your findings. In other words, finding the records, identify them, copying as much as you can, whether it's by photograph or writing down, and not sitting there analyzing or writing your article or developing your book or whatever it is that you're doing. So here's some more suggestions. Number one, obtain a Library of Congress reader identification card if you're 16 or older. Okay. There is a youth room in the Library of Congress. It has a marvelous collection of young reader books. We went there a couple of times, even with our grandkids, and it was like living in a candy shop or the creamery at Ninth or something. Some kind of, wonderful place that has wonderful things. and was very, very interesting. But that's a completely different part. That's not the part where we're doing research. Contact the specific reading room or research center relevant to your research in advance. Now, in the Library of Congress, it's not just the Library of Congress. The records are divided up by the reading rooms. So there's international records, there's records of whatever area, and each of those have their own reading room. And make an appointment, which is optional but encouraged, to ensure the collection materials are accessible during your visit. So that's kind of the most important thing. Now there's lockers for personal belongings, free lockers, and they are the things you can't carry into the reading rooms. The reading rooms are where you get actual hands-on contact with the material. And they have orientations, consultations, workshops, and everything, and videos and all sorts of things. And you might just want to visit the main reading room, which is open to visitors for viewing. And you can see it. The tour that you take in the library is that you'll be able to overlook the reading room. You can't go into the reading room, but you can look at it. So here's the reader registration and access to the Library of Congress reading rooms. Here's the part of the Library of Congress. It's on the record, on the website. You can see down the side, on the left-hand side, there are lots of different subject headings of what's going on at the library. There's events, there's concerts, there's readings, there's all sorts of things going on. And you have a large exhibit area where they put some of the things from their collections, and it's very, very interesting place to visit. And it's your reader's ID card is good for 2 years, and you can't renew it online. You have to go to the Library of Congress directly to renew it. So you're going to have to spend some time initially when you go to the library getting into the library. In other words, going through the requirements that are in force in that particular day or week or year that you go there. So here's the organizational chart. This is also right on the website. And it's interesting of all the different parts. Now, not all of these are going to have reading rooms because you can go and get the list of the reading rooms and their contents, what absence. Now, what might happen if you're doing certain kinds of research is you may have to go to the main reading room and then you may have to visit the other reading rooms to get other materials. So it's not like there's a one place that you can get all of the information at once. Well, one thing that was interesting about the organizational chart on here, the Librarian of Congress at the time of this printing was Carla Hayden, and the principal deputy was Jay Sweeney. It was interesting because as we were working at digitizing records at the Maryland State Archives, we were helping at the Family History Center in Annapolis. We were there frequently, and some of the people we were helping, all of them were Spanish speaking. One of the people who came to me and asked for help was Jay Sweeney. And I didn't know where he worked. I had no idea who he was. I had nothing. I didn't have any time, whatever. But I asked him when I was helping him find some of his ancestors. I said, well, where do you work? He said, downtown. And I went, that meant he went to DC from Annapolis. And I said, well, what do you do downtown? He said, oh, I work at the Library of Congress. And I said, oh, that's interesting. So what do you do at the Library of Congress? He says, I'm in charge of all the research. And I went, oh. And then I thought, what am I doing helping you with research? Anyway, it was very interesting to us because he basically offered to take us on an extensive tour of the Library of Congress to all the places that nobody else gets into because you don't go there every day. So on a by appointment basis, we showed up early at the door of the Library of Congress, and he met us and took us through all of the back rooms and all the ordering places and where they were doing all the cataloging department and all of the other special collections areas. And it was an extensive insight into the Library of Congress. So I guess it goes back to it takes who you know to do some of the things that you need to do when you're doing research. I mentioned this earlier, that same subjects and classifications in the classification system may be in different places. That means different physical places within the library or storage areas. And the only way that you can get into this is basically beginning to learn the stacks. And so you have to rely on people who are knowledgeable about the total content of the library. Now, if you go to a big major library like any university library, so if you're going to one of the university libraries to do some research, first of all, you'd have to establish what access you had as a non-student or non-staff person for that university. And it's assuming they gave you access to some of the records, there might be more record requirements to get access to the special collections documents, which are the kinds of things, original manuscripts and things that are not in circulation, non-circulating areas of the library. Now, the Library of Congress is totally non-circulating. That means you can't check stuff out of the library. Everything stays in the library. That's the purpose of the reading rooms. You will not be able to carry any items out because you have to go through electronic surveillance to get out of the library. And all the books have embedded in them, all the materials have embedded in them electronic devices that'll set off the alarm. Having set off an alarm one time, that was not something that I wanted to do. I did it at the BYU library, the Harold B. Lee Library, and that was not a good experience. Okay. So here it is, the Library of Congress classification all on. This is like the very, very limited A through Z kind of selection of topics. Now, within those topics, they are developed to the point where, like I mentioned previously, the physical books were like in 20 volumes of this huge volumes of books. But now it's all online, it's all available to search, and the catalog is there. And so you can look at it in a WordPerfect version or a Word version of the catalog. So here's what it looks like when you start to get into it. And you click on the little button up there and you see Browse Advanced Keyword Search History, and then all the information about the catalog and more and more information. And then you get into learning how to look through the information that's there and filter it down to where you can almost find what you're looking for. So you're going to need to know all sorts of things. One thing you'll see here is type of material, and that's whether the item you're looking for, how it's cataloged depends on its physical requirement, what it is physically. So all text, is it a text? Well, that means a book and periodicals, and then there's our manuscripts, and then a book or film or video or map. In other words, you need to know that what each one of these categories, and there's more, you can see a little bar on the side that slides down to it, that all of these are basically up to the library. And then you need to know how to read the Congress call numbers, which will tell you where the item is and where it's physically located in the library. And I got this one out of How to Read Library of Congress Call Numbers out of the University of Louisville. And there's the URL down the bottom. This is not the only one there is. There's a few dozens and dozens of these and How to Work with the Library of Congress websites out there. And the Library of Congress catalog system is used by a lot of other libraries. Now, you may know of the existence of a large website called WorldCat, WRLDCAT, worldcat.org. WorldCat is the catalog of all the catalogs. So the catalogs across the world have begun to be put into this one large catalog. And so the WorldCat number is now the identification number for many books out there. There used to be other numbers, the ISBN numbers and other numbers that would identify books. In the Library of Congress, you just might want to know that genealogy and family history are not the same thing. They're cataloged differently. What they consider to be family history is mostly histories of families. In other words, books about families. We would call them surname books or books that were written about a specific family. So you just have to be aware that you're going to look in a lot more than one place because you may want a family history. That may be what you're looking for. And if you're over the genealogy section, none of those books are cataloged there. So that's kind of the interesting thing. There used to be a history and genealogy reading room, a separate room where the genealogy collection was kept. The last time when we were there physically, times we were there in the library, was that the history and genealogy room had been consolidated into the main reading room, which meant that the little doors you see around the reading room go into little sections of materials. Then the main stacks was back through the doors that went off into the stacks. That meant the lit shelves that were just a huge stack of shelves up through the center of this huge building. And there was a section for family history and genealogy. As I went through that, my impression was this isn't even half of what we have in any of either the BYU or the Salt Lake Library. I mean, it's not close to the Salt Lake Library. So what does that say at this point? It would say to me that as a genealogist, I would plan a trip to the Salt Lake Library or the BYU Library or both long before I would take a trip to DC. So that was my at least observation. They have over 100,000 local histories and more than 50,000 family histories. The Family Search Library has somewhere between 60,000, 60,000, 600,000. I don't know. There's a lot of material. I don't remember the number right now. And the Library of Congress has strong collections for Western European, United Kingdom, Ireland, and Germany. So you may want to look into that if you're doing research in any of those countries. Now, here's a kind of a caveat here near the end. Don't confuse the holdings of the Library of Congress with the National Archives. The National Archives saves documents from agencies and the government around the world, exception for Congress. Congress's records and the Library of Congress. But the National Archives may have what you're looking for. And that's a whole different story. But almost everything I've said during this presentation applies to the National Archives. There's a reading room. You have to go through the process. You have to qualify for a reader's card. You have to gain access. You have to have, actually, they won't even let you in the National Archives unless you sit down with a research expert who will then evaluate what you need and what you're looking for and decide whether you can go into the library and work. So it's a little bit different process there. And once again, I'd urge you to explore the website completely before planning and traveling to the library. There's just a lot of here. And you might look to see it down there. It's almost invisible, but you understand the U.S. Copyright Office is part of the Library of Congress. So if you need to know about copyright, it's it's copyright.gov, and it's part of the Library of Congress. Now, the digital collections are, of course, searchable from your home, from your computer. And one is Chronicling America, Historic American Newspapers. And that is a very valuable collection for doing research. If you haven't used it, if you haven't gotten on the Library of Congress and used their newspaper website, you'll be maybe surprised at the millions and millions of newspaper collections that they have. So there's lots of very, very specific things here, like Civil War selections. Now, there's where you get into the problem of dividing this up between the National Archives and the Library of Congress. The Library of Congress has like photographs. The National Archives has like actual Army, Civil War Army records. So, I mean, that's the difference. That you have to think that through and work through which one has what. Many programs, services, lovely stuff. So keep learning and searching. And thanks for watching. Any questions come up while we were going on and on? What device did I use to photograph materials? I use my iPhone. I don't use a tripod usually. I would if I were going to do a lot of material. Okay. Well, and the interesting thing here is that what I've said about about the Library of Congress, is generally applicable to most of the larger libraries in the country. You're always going to find sections of the library that are not accessible. They're called special collections libraries in university libraries. And there are other libraries, like I mentioned, the Huntington. There's others. There's huge privately run libraries around the country, and they all have their different set of access and records. And so there's more to wondering about this. Well, thanks, everybody.